So I have something a little different today, more of a house project for my basement. We recently had to replace our washer and dryer, and in doing that we had to clear up some space going down our basement to be able to get the old ones out and the new ones in. And with that space clear, I thought this would be a good chance to build a really simple laundry station. It's only going to require 3 power tools. Really all you need is a circular saw, a drill, and a jigsaw. I think I've mentioned before that we're planning to rebuild our house in another year or two. So because of that, I went with cheaper materials and an easier to disassemble construction, because hopefully in a year or two we're going to have to haul this washer and dryer back upstairs. And in order to do that, this laundry station has to be able to come out, just because the ergonomics of that space, it's just too small. And I've divided this project into 2 parts. There is the actual laundry station itself, where you can store your laundry baskets, have a surface for folding clothes. That'll be 6 feet long, 3 feet high, so just standard cabinet height, and 24 inches deep. It'll comfortably fit 6 of the just regular cheap laundry baskets that you get at Walmart or Target. And if you want them to get cozy, you could probably fit 8. The second part is going to be a simple shelf that will hang above this, where you can store your laundry detergent and have a rod to be able to put hangers on. So for the first part, for the base, you're going to need 5 2x4s. I went with just the 92 and 5/8 because it was like 75 cents cheaper than the 96-inch ones. And the way these cuts work out for this space that I have, that extra couple of inches on a 96 is just going to get wasted anyway. You'll need 1 sheet of OSB, just the regular 4 foot by 8 foot by, I think it's 7/16, a box of 2-inch screws, a box of 1-inch screws, and depending on where you're going to put this, with mine it's right up against a brick wall. I'm using concrete screws to anchor that to the wall. You probably really don't even need to anchor it, but if you are going to anchor it to the wall, make sure you know what's in and behind that wall, so you don't accidentally drill into a power line or some sort of plumbing or something like that. And of course, if this is just regular studs and drywall, then you don't need the concrete screws, you just use regular screws. You'll need either a 6-foot countertop, or if you're going on the cheap like I did, go with 1 sheet of either 3/4 inch MDF or 3/4 inch particle board. Like I said, I'm planning to tear this house down in the next year and a half, so I just went with a particle board. It's not pretty, but for what I need it for, it'll do just fine. If you are using the particle board or the MDF, you will need some glue. If you would prefer a countertop, but you're still trying to keep this on the cheap, maybe check out a place like Restore that Habitat for Humanity has. You may be able to get a recycled one there. That's what I tried to do, but I couldn't find any that were the right size and didn't already have a sink hole cut out, which I don't need. For the second part of this, you'll need the leftover 2x4s from the first part, and 2 more, so your total order, you want probably 7 2x4s, and a piece of dowel rod. I'm going with 1.25 inches, just because that's going to be nice and sturdy. For the base of this shelf, it's just going to be using the leftover OSB from the base part, so you won't need to buy that separately. Now, a couple things to make this easier. When you buy the OSB and you buy the particle board or MDF, at Home Depot or Lowe's, they'll do a couple of cuts for you for free. Now, they don't guarantee their accuracy, but it's generally close enough. At least at mine it is. I don't know. Your mileage may vary on that. So what I did to help make this more simple is, for the particle board, I had them cut 2 feet off of one end, looking at the board horizontally. I had them cut off 2 feet off one end and then slice it right down the middle. The reason for that is this has to fit into a 6-foot space, so those last 2 feet I don't need. You could obviously do the same thing with the OSB, but I already had OSB at home. Alright, so for the top, because it's wintertime here and it's cold and rainy outside, I had to bring this inside to do the gluing. So I just spread out a bunch of glue and then use my modified scraper to get that all kind of spread out. Sandwich the other board on top and screw that together. The screws, of course, acting as clamps. You don't really need a whole lot of them. Just a couple every few feet is probably good enough. And then let that dry overnight. For the finish on the top, I just used a brushing semi-gloss lacquer, just what I had on hand. I don't think it's really important the type of finish that you use for this type of a thing, but you could just paint the top, you could use polyurethane, you could use shellac, whatever you want. In this case, the finish is really just there to make sure that this surface is kind of slick so that it's easy to fold clothes and that it's easy to clean. Because of the spot where this is going, in my case, this actually has to be put together in stages. With the top done, we need to grab 3 2x4s. You probably want your nicest ones for this. I'm lining them up so that I can cut them all at once. You can do them individually. From each of these first 3 2x4s, we need to measure and cut 2 34.5-inch pieces. These will make up the front and the back of the base. Then with the remaining pieces that are left, we need to cut each of those down to 21 inches. This is going to give us the middle piece at the bottom of each of these 3 legs. And then we need to grab 2 more 2x4s, and from these we're going to cut 6 more pieces at 21 inches long. You should now have 9 pieces that are 21 inches long and 6 pieces that are 34.5 inches long. For the pieces that are 34.5 inches long, we need to pre-drill for some screws that are going to connect these to the 21-inch pieces. To help make it easier to get the screws in the right place, if you take one of your offcuts and use that to mark a line at the bottom, that's how tall the pieces that are going to go horizontally are, and then from there it's really easy to just scribe a line that's halfway in between that and the edge of the board, and then draw 2 X's for the places that you need to drill for these screws. Placement isn't vital. You want it about in the center and just have those 2 kind of evenly distributed in there. They don't really need to be measured out. We'll be able to assemble these easier if we pre-drill first. You want to pick a drill bit that's about the same size as the threads on the screw. I went with a 5/32 drill bit. Then just at every spot that you drew an X, drill all the way through. Do that on all 6 of the leg pieces. To assemble the legs, you need 2 of the 34.5-inch pieces and 2 of the 21-inch pieces, and organize those in a rectangle with the shorter pieces in between the longer ones. Once you're sure everything is square, then go ahead and start screwing these together through the holes that we've pre-drilled using the 2-inch screws. I didn't put in any glue on these joints. You obviously could. I didn't, just because I need to be able to remove this in the future. Then just rinse and repeat this for all 3 legs, and make sure to not put in the middle piece just yet. With each of these legs, pick one end to be the up end and go ahead and mark that. Do that on all 3. And then along the edge, from the side that is going to be the down, measure up 17 inches and strike a line. Do that for all 3. Then with a speed square, copy that line around to the other face, and do this on each side of all 3 legs. And just like we did at the bottom and top of each of these legs, grab a piece of scrap and use that to mark the thickness of the board and mark 2 X's to pre-drill. These only need to be on the front faces of the 3 legs. The back faces we won't have access to when these are installed. It'll make sense when we get to assembly. On the back side of each leg, you want to mark at 17 inches as well from the bottom and use your speed square to mark a line there. We don't need to do any pre-drilling at this part though. This is just a guideline to help us get that middle piece, that middle shelf in later on. On the top side of the legs, we need to mark 3 lines, one at 12 inches and then one at 4 inches from either end. These are going to be another set of holes that we need to pre-drill that we're going to use to attach the tabletop to the legs. This is another spot to use the speed square to transfer those lines to the underside of that top piece so that we can roughly mark a center where we're going to pre-drill. And of course do this for all 3. While you're pre-drilling, go ahead and pre-drill at the spot where you measured up 17 inches. That'll be on the front of all 3 legs. And because I'm pre-drilling, on the back side of all 3 legs, I'm going to measure down 4 inches, strike a mark there in the center, and this is where I'm going to use the concrete screws to attach these legs to the wall. This step is optional if you don't want to anchor your legs to the wall. So next we need to take our OSB and trim it to fit the space we're going in. So I said mine is going to be 6 foot, so I'm striking a line 24 inches from the end of this single sheet of OSB. There's another sheet underneath it, that's just the top to my saw table. And I'm going to take one of my 2x4 scraps and clamp it along the lines that I marked, and I'm going to use that as a straight edge to guide my circular saw. So basically you're getting a very similar cut to what you would get with a track saw, but without the track saw. To do this, you need to know the distance between that inside edge of your saw base and the outside edge of the saw blade, and you need to set your 2x4 that distance to the offside of whatever your cut is going to be. Next, I struck a line right at 24 inches to cut the other way. This is so that I've got 2 shelves for the laundry station that are the same size. And again, I'm just going to use a 2x4 as my straight edge and try to match it up with the lines that I struck, accounting for that distance between the blade and the saw base. One disadvantage to a battery-powered circular saw is my battery died right in the middle of the cut. Next, I'm going to stack the 2 of these because I need to cut out 6 spots, 1 at each corner and then 1 on the center lengthwise on each side. These will be to make room for the 2x4s. So again, just using that offcut as a template, I'm marking each corner for where I need to cut. And then for the center, I'm striking a line at 34 1/4 and 37 3/4, and that is because the 2x4 is 3.5 inches wide. Next, I just take my jigsaw, and in this case, I actually cut to the outside of the line. I wanted to have a little bit of wiggle room for when I try to put these shelves in place, so that there's a little bit of gap there if I need it, in case things aren't perfectly in line and perfectly square. So from here, once you've got that corner done, you want to get the 2 centers and the other 3 corners done. With the centers, usually you have to go down each side and then come back in at an angle and then kind of clean up that center part. So with that 2-foot piece that we cut off from the OSB, we're going to cut that in half and use that to be the shelf for the part 2 of this project, the part that will actually hang above the laundry station where you can store your soap and have a hanger rack. So I just marked off at 1 foot and used a scrap of 2x4 to strike the line, and this time I just cut it freehand. So depending on where and how you want to install the base for your laundry station, this step may be optional. So using that hole on the back of the leg that I had pre-drilled earlier for the concrete screws, I use that as a guide with the concrete drill bit to mark where I needed to drill a hole for the concrete screws. And when drilling in concrete, if you have access to a drill that has a hammer function, that will go much quicker, but a regular drill can do it as well. It's just going to take a while. With that first leg in place, we need to set the second and third right up next to it and then slide both shelves in between. The reason for this is, at least in my case, there's just no room to do it any other way. I didn't build these without the top piece just because the 2 screws at the bottom of the legs holding that front vertical piece to the bottom horizontal piece would be very weak and it would just be really easy to break. So instead I built it as that whole outline, I guess. So this way you just have to kind of move things around until you're able to get that bottom shelf in place, and just go ahead and let the second shelf sit on it for the time being. Then you'll need your 1-inch screws and lift that top shelf out of the way, and I put a couple screws in across the bottom of each leg. This is going to help the whole thing be a lot more stable. Okay, the next part is kind of tricky. This is the middle shelf, but obviously there's nothing to hold the shelf yet. So what I need to do is lift this piece to the top, clamp it in place, then I can put in the shelf supports and then lower it back down. If the area that you're planning to put this in, if you've got nice, good access to it, it would be better to assemble all this outside and bring it in. I don't have that kind of space, so that's why I'm assembling it in place. So what I'm going to do to get this in place is I've got the holes here that I've pre-drilled for my wall anchors. I'm just going to put in some 1-inch screws that I can rest this piece on, clamp on the other side to hold it out of the way. All right, now we've got this out of the way. Now I can put in the middle shelf supports. Because of how dark it is down here, this may not show up very well, but basically what I'll be doing is taking these center pieces, lining them up with the holes that I had pre-drilled earlier, and then I can use the speed square to help make sure that they're at the right angle, and then I'll screw those in. And then for the screws on the back, because that's against the wall, obviously I can't screw in this direction, so I'm just going to put the screws through at an angle, kind of like if you were to toenail something, but we're using screws instead of nails. I don't know how well that shows up, but I've got the speed square in the back to show that this shelf is square with that back brace. So now I'm going to take one of these screws and come at it from the side. You could pre-drill, but where these screws kind of drill their own hole, I'm not too worried about that, but it would make it a little bit easier. So that one's in. So now I'll just do the same thing for the other two. All right, now that these are in place, I'm going to add a couple more 1-inch screws along the back for the bottom shelf, and then we'll get this one in place. Okay, now let's remove these clamps. Go ahead and screw this one in place. And I'm just doing 3 screws across each support. Okay, now I'm going to remove these 2 screws that I used to hold that second shelf in place. And now that we've got that done, now we can drill for the last 2 anchors. Okay, so it's in. Not a very good shot. Like I said, there's not a lot of room down here. I also wanted to mention a couple of alternatives. So obviously, if you're going to be drilling into a wall, make sure you know what's behind the wall and in the wall. I'm somewhat lucky in this situation in that this house was built so long ago. My house is over 100 years old. All of the wiring and plumbing that was added afterwards is all actually mounted to the wall in other areas, so it's really easy for me to tell where it's safe and where it's not. If your house is a little more modern, then make sure and check the walls first, or ask somebody to check it for you if you don't know how, to make sure that you're not going to drill into wiring or plumbing or anything like that. There are alternatives to these concrete anchors that I use, these concrete screws rather. These aren't actually the regular anchors. You could use concrete anchors, but you do have to drill a bigger hole. Another thing that you can use is, I'm probably going to get the name wrong, I think it's a pneumatic nailer. Basically, it's this long piece of metal that you put in a small, like a 22 caliber rifle blank that you put into it, and you hit it with a hammer, and it has a special hardened nail that can go through the board and into the wood. For me, I have one of those tools, but I chose not to use it because I need to be able to remove this. And really, once the shelves are secured in and the top is bolted on, you could probably get away without it being secured to the wall. I just didn't want to go that route.
So now we need to slide the tabletop in place. We want our finished side up and finished edge out, of course. Then some of the 2-inch screws going through those holes that I pre-drilled to get this tightened down all the way. The 1-inch screws wouldn't be long enough. Now for the shelf, we need to measure and cut from our remaining 2x4s 4 pieces at 30 inches long. And 4 pieces at 18 inches long. And then, just like before, take a scrap to mark out where you're going to pre-drill and get the pre-drilling done on all of the 18-inch pieces. Form it up in a rectangle again, this time with the short pieces on the outside, and give it 2 of the 2-inch screws at every corner. You should end up with 2 shelf frames. And then pre-drill for where you're going to screw these in. I'm screwing mine into the floor joists above this area instead of into the wall, so that's why they're going on top. We also need to drill a hole for the dowel rod. I used 1.25" dowel, and I went down 4 inches. If you have a less powerful drill, you may want to go with a smaller dowel, something like 3/4 inch or 1 inch, just because with a spade bit at 1.25 inches, it takes a beefy drill to be able to make that cut. You need a scrap about 6 inches long to cut another hole of the same size. This will be for the other end of your dowel rod, and also pre-drill for screws or nails on this one. And with our leftover piece of OSB, we also need to cut out a 30-inch piece. And then quickly do a test fit. I actually cut it just a hair shy of 30 inches just to be sure it would fit in nice and easy. Now for mine, since I'm hanging it from floor joists from the room above me, I had to cut some blocks to make the shelf a little bit lower and to provide some clearance for some plumbing and electrical that was at some point nailed down on the bottom of these floor joists. So this is something of an extender to avoid those pieces. And then these had to be pre-drilled, and for these, since I'm actually having to drill all the way through, I had to mark on both sides because my drill bit isn't long enough to go all the way through. And my driver bit isn't long enough either, so I still use the 5/32 bit on both sides, and then on the side that the screw is going to come in from, I went with a larger 1/2 inch bit and drilled down about 2 inches, that's what the tape marks, so that there would be a big enough hole for the driver bit to get down there too. It just needs enough clearance. Here you can see some of that plumbing and wiring, and these brace avoid that. Use the level to just make sure they're level. You may need to put in some shims if they're not. As long as it's close, that's probably good enough. Now for the dowel, to get it to the right length, you don't want to use your circular saw. So I just put it up against the wall and then against the inside of that end piece as a marker and used a hand saw to cut that to length. And then I used 2 screws under each of those hangers to get the first shelf bracket in place. Got the bottom pinned in there. Put in the second shelf bracket, which had the dowel already in it. And the hanger on the other end is just sitting there. Couple 1-inch screws to get that shelf piece screwed in. I put 1 screw in to the dowel just to secure it, and on the other end I actually did use my powder actuated nailer because I had run out of cement screws.
So anyway, there you go. That is my simple, cheap DIY laundry station. Hopefully that's useful, at least give you some ideas if you're looking for a similar solution. Here's one way to attack it. Now obviously the measurements may vary a little depending on the space that you have available. So thanks for watching, and if you want to see more of the things that I do in my shop, please subscribe. We'll see you next time.